Welcome everybody. This is our first unveiling of our work to date on what we're going to do with Melrose Terrace. I know there's been a lot of discussion over the last 7 years since the flood about what would happen here. At a point about a year or two, year and a half ago, the decision was made that the best future use for Melrose Terrace is as stormwater storage for the properties and the area downstream of here. So this last year we applied with the state of Vermont. The state of Vermont representative can't be with us today. She had a bad ski accident, but she has helped us enormously to make an application to FEMA for what's called a pre-disaster mitigation application. Sort of ironic because our disaster already happened, but hopefully it'll be pre the next one. So we have with us today Roy Schiff and Brian from Malone and McBroom. They've been our engineers on this project pretty much since the day after the storm. So they've done a great deal of work and we'll be sharing that with you. Rod Francis is here from the town, as is Brian Banyan. Rod's the town planner, Brian's the zoning administrator. And we've been working quite closely with the town on this project. So this is warned, and I will let you all explain the clomer and the lumber and all of those other good things. So the other information is that it is a public meeting. We are having it videoed, and it will be. We will be showing it on BCTV afterwards for the benefit of the greater community. And the last important two things to say are that we have coffee and munchkins in the back, and we have a bathroom right down the hall here on the left-hand side. So we have left 2 hours for this meeting. If we need all of that time, we will take it. If we don't, okay. There's a sign-up sheet here. If you have not signed in, please make sure that you do before you leave, so we have a record of everybody that attended. We don't sell data. We don't know anything about Cambridge Analytics. We don't go there, so you're safe. So with that, Roy, I will turn over to you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. All right, just quick clarification. So, Chris, Jessica, our coworker who's been on here, she got hurt.
She's the one who got hurt.
Yeah, Lauren from Emergency Management is here.
Did not get a ski accident. I'm sorry to hear that Jessica
Yes.
did.
Totally.
Yeah, just to clarify that. All right, just quick clarification. So, Chris, Jessica, our coworker who's been on here, she got hurt.
She's the one who got hurt.
Yeah, Lauren from Emergency Management is here.
Did not get a ski accident. I'm sorry to hear that Jessica
Yes.
did.
Totally.
Yeah, just to clarify that.
Really sorry.
It's going to be okay, thankfully. Yeah, and Lauren's been helping us with the grant application.
My bad.
So the plan for today, as Chris said, we have 2 hours, a fairly long time, and Brian and I have information to share with you all. First about the alternatives and where we landed with this project. We've been working with the town and the partnerships for some time now. And also, as part of this project, we're required to do a letter of map revision, which is a formal FEMA process to update the flood maps. And in this case, we're going to be reducing the flood levels, shrinking the floodplain a little bit. And Brian's going to show you the mapping that we're going to be applying to FEMA to change with the town. And then there should be ample time for questions and discussion. So feel free to ask questions as we go. And then we have a concept design plan. If you want to see what this thing looks like, I'll show you some clips from the plans, but if you want to take a little bit of an extra look on paper, we're happy to stick around after. and look at these plans. So yeah, with that we'll get going. So here's a shot from Irene. The area has seen a lot of flooding even before Irene, and these are some sad pictures from that day where you can see, water up near the windows here. In the 70s and 80s, Army Corps did a study that showed flood levels about the 100-year flood near this level. So this was a really large flood. And you all know Whetstone Brook is the flood source. It caused a lot of damage both in West Brattleboro and downtown, and the storm caused a lot of damage around the state. So with that in mind, we were armed to the task of what can we do to keep people safer. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, this is being a little finicky. Oops. There we go. So I wanted to give you, this is a bird's eye view of where we're sitting. We're actually right in the middle here. Let's see. And here is Whetstone Brook, and it flows down and across the screen. Okay, for orientation, this is the George F. Miller Drive and Bridge. And the brook actually, the brook path flows under the bridge, down around the site. And during the flood, there was what's known as a channel avulsion. The river jumped out of its banks, and it actually flowed largely along Melrose Street and caused a lot of damage on the back of these buildings. These lines on here, these are the FEMA floodplain. This is the 500-year floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, and these are very rare flood events like Irene. And then this dotted line signifies the erosion hazard area where this river naturally wants to migrate. And you can see all these buildings are down in the floodplain. These buildings are not in a great spot. They're in a hazardous location. Although it's beautiful, those times when the river floods or moves, these buildings are prone to damage. And then we have the complicating factor that this river likes to jump around or avulse, and it jumps out the back here. For those of you who don't spend a lot of time up in this area, there's a big increase in elevation in the back here along Melrose Street, and then these houses are actually pretty high up out of the floodplain. And you can see that by this line kind of dipping towards the river. We'll talk a little bit about both George F. Miller Drive, but the Route 9 bridge is actually a hydraulic control for the water, sort of holds big floods back into this site. All right. Oops. Okay, so here's the bridge opening. Actually, let me just double check. I want to make sure. Okay. This is the George F. Miller Bridge. It's about 55 feet wide. The bank full width of the channel is about 60 feet. That's the full width of the channel, so the bridge is a little bit undersized. It can pass a bridge that's a little larger than a 25-year flood. The flood you'd expect to happen once every 25 years, so it's a pretty good sized bridge. It does push water back during a big flood, and it is probably a contributing factor to why during Irene the water backed up, got clogged, and then turned and jumped down along Melrose Street. And then here's the bridge downstream. You can see the Route 9 bridge. It's an arched bridge. You can see the water line hanging off it. Now this bridge is tilted, so it functions smaller than it really is, roughly 47 feet, and again the channel wants to be 60 feet wide. So this bridge fills up around the 10 to 20-year flood, so a little smaller capacity. Most of our bridges today are designed for the 50-year flood, something a little bigger. Okay, so we talked about backwatering, and so the bridges are pushing water back into the site, and all the buildings are sitting in lowlands, low floodplains, and so you have ponding. But also you have a lot of sediment and debris that drops out of the river right in this area, and that's a contributing factor to why the river jumped and turned, observed during Irene. So we're really here to talk partially about what a solution is that this project team has selected, but also about the FEMA regulated areas and changing these maps. 7 of these buildings are in the floodway, which is the area really where the active river flows. These are the buildings right along here when the river fills up. And then 15 are in the floodplain. These are big accumulations of buildings in the floodplain. 11 of these are in the erosion hazard zone and 13 in the river corridor, the migration area. So it's a high density of buildings that are sitting in a vulnerable location. So we performed an alternatives analysis. We looked at a whole range of possible solutions. The first one we always look at is not doing anything. And then we looked at removing buildings. We looked at restoring the floodplain. So some fill was likely placed to put those buildings in the location they're in. And what that did was that displaced places where the water can spread out and safely be stored. And so it increased the flood risk around the area. And this happens all along our rivers. It's the settlement pattern in New England. We went to the rivers for power, then we tended to fill in a little bit, and then the rivers sort of do their thing and create damage when there's flooding. We looked at replacing the bridges, removing the bridges, putting in overflow culverts, and we looked at combinations of all these things. And there's a really detailed report we're happy to share with you. We're not going to go into the excruciating details. It will put you all to sleep. But we want to just really show you the answer and then show you what this thing looks like. So this is the summary table. And the minuses mean it doesn't really work for that objective. And the pluses mean it works well for the objective. And the zeros means it kind of goes either way. And we looked at things like reducing flood and erosion to this property. Reducing flood and erosion to the surrounding properties. There's a lot of infrastructure and private property around Melrose Terrace. We looked at roads and bridges separately, maintaining usable buildings, environmental benefits or impacts, permitting feasibility, and also the cost of such a project. So these are the criteria that we evaluated all these projects. And we probably looked at about 30 to 40 alternatives, different combinations, including full floodplain restoration and backing away, pulling out the George F. Miller Drive Bridge, which we learned is not a possibility because we need to be able to get in here and out of here in 2 locations. Looking at partial floodplain restoration. Looking at different alternatives at the bridges. It's not likely as part of this project we're going to go replace the Route 9 bridge, but what we've done is sort of preliminary sized it for a future replacement. It will improve the flood patterns in this area. And then also we looked at removing different numbers of buildings and combinations. Okay, and we really looked for the sweet spot in cost, permit feasibility, impacts, damage reduction. And where we landed was, with the help of this project team, was to pull back 11 buildings that are closest to the river. That preserves, I believe, 4 or 5 buildings. And that would include lowering the land down to reconnect for about 4 acres of floodplain in here. And what that does is that lowers the flood elevations and also shrinks the floodplain for certain floods. In addition, we wanted to get more water through the embankment of the bridge here, so we installed an overflow culvert at the George F. Miller Drive Bridge. And what does this get for us? Well, the buildings that are most likely to flood in a big event are gone. It reduces the area of flood levels from 1 to 3 feet. There's another part of that story. And then it reduces flood levels about 7 feet because it's really unlikely now the river will fill up and shoot behind the back of these buildings where the flood level can really build up. So we have a floodplain where the river is going to drop down into during flood stage, and it's not going to want to jump its path and get behind those buildings. And it's also going to create a deposition area for sediment and wood. And this is really important for downstream locations. Along the Whetstone Brook, the river's been channelized a lot, and there's no place for it to spill out and put stuff safely. So it often gets to bridges, the bridges clog up, or it gets to other properties and there's damage there. And this will be a place where the sediment can come out. You could scoop it up if it was a lot of sediment, or it can just grow, stuff will grow in the floodplain. It can be a place to walk, and the sediment will have sort of places to spill out along with some nutrients. So it will protect downstream properties, and when Brian shows the maps, you'll see it actually protects upstream properties as well by shrinking the flood levels. So here's a quick snapshot of the plans that we have up here for you to take a look at. This is just a title sheet. These are concept plans, so We're happy to receive your feedback. If you have ideas about the plans, they're still being developed. And this is the project area where the floodplain is going to be restored. Again, bird's eye view. And now you can see, again, here's the river. Okay, the darker buildings are the ones to be removed. Here's where we're sitting right now over here, and these buildings are remaining. And there'd actually be a slope that's in this crosshatch that you would drop down to the floodplain. And this would have some armor stone on it, and then it would be covered and put vegetation on it so it blends into the landscape. Keeps the area looking nice and also has habitat benefits. So when the river does spread out, because we have infrastructure and property in the back here, we'd actually contain it in this area. And this width was set, you can see, to approximate this erosion hazard zone. So we're letting the river, we're kind of sharing the space back to the river. We're giving it the space it needs to be most stable and meander, and we're protecting the back of the floodplain where we're going to still have properties and roads and infrastructure. You can see the black, that's the new overflow culvert. So where we lower the floodplain just on the inside, on our side of the river, as you come into the complex here, you'll see there'll be an overflow culvert, and that will help pass a little more water. And that brings up the design capacity or the flow capacity of the bridge to pass a larger flood. So that's the bird's eye view of the plan. And I thought we could look at, oops, apologize. Stop. Trick birthday candles, okay. So here's the cross-section view. So if you went out to the river and took a slice across the river, this is what you'd see. And these are viewed looking downstream. So here's a downstream area, and here's a building that's going to stay. So I'm looking down the river like as if I'm in a canoe. Here's a building that's sitting right in the floodplain, and that building's going to come out, and all this cross-hatched material is going to be cut down. So several feet of material. This has an average cut depth of 4 feet, and the proposed width is 125 feet. And what you see is now the 10-year flood can actually spread out a little bit, and it's not all in the channel. When you scrunch the water down, the velocity of the water goes up, and it becomes very erosive. And that can lead to a lot of erosion damage. So now we're letting the water access its historic floodplain. This is the shot, the cross-section, as if you're coming in a canoe right up to the George F. Miller Drive Bridge. The bridge is all staying the same, but what you see now is you're cutting fill down to the floodplain, and here's your overflow culvert. The building sitting right at the bridge would be removed. Here's the stone on the back. This is to protect the road, Melrose, the street, and the other buildings that are now sitting back in this area. So we're introducing protection, and again, we would cover that with a soil layer and plant it, so you wouldn't know that rock is there. And then now moving up further up into the property, you can see here a wider cut of removing all that fill, restoring floodplain. You can see there are trees in here. You typically plant these areas so they grow back, and they'll naturally take over once we start the planting. Right, so we're trying to, again, give the river more storage space to store the water. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk through these floodplain maps. Maybe we can take a pause for a second and to see if anyone's got quick questions on sort of the concept design or the alternative.
Hi, I was just curious, what would be the purpose of leaving those remaining buildings?
So we can live in them.
Yeah, they're occupied. They're occupied.
And that's going to continue?
No.
Oh.
They're occupied now. We have done the first phase of the relocation of residents from Melrose to Red Clover,
Right.
which is by Walgreens. That's 55 people. We have 25 left, and they're in those buildings. So we can't demolish the buildings they're in until we have a place for them to live, and we're working on that.
But once people are not living in there, do you plan on demolishing them and turning that into this plan, or?
That is the intent. That is the hope. We don't have money for it, but that would be the plan, would be to turn all of this into flood mitigation area.
But this plan is talking about leaving those buildings
For now.
the foreseeable future. This plan is only focused in on
How
that.
long has this been classified a river? I thought it was broke. Not that it makes any difference.
I was just speaking loosely when I use the term river. You can call it a brook. It's a little smaller than a
Used to be a tiny little thing,
yeah.
years ago, you guys probably remember.
Yeah. Just to go to your point, we've had this discussion about what happens in the future. The project as it's designed now won't preclude, it won't change what can happen in the future here. The one thing, you would just continue with the floodplain restoration and demolition and utility work to sort of decommission the current use of the site.
You just expand it, basically.
You would just expand it. You would build on what you've done now. So you wouldn't be, we would try to not do anything that would block us from doing that in the future. There would be rock here, like this rock application, you would just dig that up and reuse it. Either on the back if anything stays or properties back there, or you could use it as a resource in a different project. So nothing's gonna preclude completing that in the future. Yeah,
What's the time frame for the first phase, like tearing the buildings down? And maybe the culvert in and landscaped? It's nothing you're gonna get done this year, is it? Some of it, but.
We've been waiting to hear from FEMA on our pre-disaster mitigation award, and last year at about this time, when we met with them, they said that in all likelihood, we were going to get the award and that it would be coming this spring. So I have to tell you, it's been a lot of hurry up and wait. They've asked for a lot of additional engineering, a lot of additional studies. We are really hopeful that we'll get the money in time to begin this year, so we can start this work.
Still gonna take a long time, but it's a lot of secondhand brick to sell.
Well,
That's right.
one of the things to the question about, excuse me, the remaining buildings, we have absolutely no intention of having any residential use whatsoever at Melrose. It really is not safe for anybody to stay here as in a residential way.
And do you have a time frame for that?
Well, that's the idea. I mean, once we get this done and get the 25 people moved, then the idea is to demolish the rest of Melrose and turn it all into flood storage.
So you won't have this done this summer?
We would like to have an awful good start on this plan.
On
This
this
summer.
plan this summer, by fall? At least the building's down.
However the work is actually set
And
out.
the money comes.
Yeah, but we have to wait for the money,
For the money.
right, so.
I'll just put a little bit finer point on the timeframe. So Chris is right, we applied for funding in 2016. After that, it goes through review at FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C. That often takes quite a while. They identified this project as very competitive. It was reviewed against other states across the country. So if San Francisco City applied, we still are going to get this money. So the money is set aside for the project within FEMA. But after that initial review, additional questions often are asked. And they have asked an extraordinary amount of questions on this project specifically, just because of the level of work that's being done. And floodplain restoration is still something that FEMA's kind of new to, surprisingly. So this is one of the last steps we've been told in order to meet those pre-award requirements. So once this meeting is done and a follow-up select board meeting is had, all of that additional information is going to be sent to FEMA for their final review, and hopefully we'll get funding shortly thereafter. FEMA are on a time frame of their own to get this money out of the door and implemented. So I think that it's not entirely unreasonable to think that we'll be having money in hand within the next couple months max, so that we can begin the work. Yeah.
That stone, that's a barrier for the water, so it's impermeable.
It will be it's basically to resist erosion, so the river doesn't migrate into stuff that's still back there.
And is anything being considered to restore the soil quality so it's more spongy by, planting a biodiverse
Down in here,
I'm not sure what that is.
where the floodplain restoration is taking
Yes.
place. Yeah, so there is a process that you go, so you take out the earth and you would stockpile the top, that's the top of the soil layer where everything grows. And then you'd lay that back out there, and then you'd plant it with materials that would, help absorb water and slow the flow down.
Mhm.
So yeah, there'd be a whole,
The microbes do a lot of work for you
Yeah.
when you have good soil, so
Yeah.
that will really create that sponge that will keep the water where.
yeah, so that top, the A soil horizon is restored. There'll be a bit more detail in these plans as they get ready for construction.
Will all your maple trees be coming out?
Good question. We'll try to save every tree we can, so if they're not usually like 6 inches and less, we've had pretty good success. So we dig them up, and either ball them or stockpile them, and then reinstall them.
Are you bringing the grade level down, you said approximately, what, 4 feet?
4 feet, yeah.
Now, will you do that all the way from the brook, straight flat back?
There is we tend to put a little bit of slope on it, so when there is a flood and water gets in the floodplain, it will slowly over time drain out. Most natural floodplains pitch down the valley, so downhill, down the river, and also a little bit towards the river. So we would really mimic that in the design.
So none of the sidewalks or the road, once the final buildings are gone, everything will be below the grade level it is now.
That's right, so anything in this, if I go back in that, anything in this cut area will be gone. So this will be, the road will end here.
Okay,
The sidewalks will be pulled back, and, perhaps we tie into, a sidewalk, so right at the top edge. But we typically make trails down into these areas because they're really beautiful spots when they're not flooding. So people can go down and, walk and access the river in this location. But any infrastructure is going to be pulled back to this line.
my original idea was thought that if you could have left the sidewalks in the road and removed the buildings, then with the trees, you could have put in some picnic tables and had like a Melrose Park, people could come have
Yeah.
picnics. But it had to be roped off by 9:30, 10 o'clock. We wouldn't want a
Yeah,
lot of people in here at night. I
yeah,
live right across the brook
okay.
in Glen Trailer Park, and we wouldn't want a congregation of drug dealers and everything in here. But I thought that would be nice to have a little park for
Yeah,
people to come and have a picnic during the day or something.
yeah, and I think that's still possible. It's just going to be lower down.
Just one-
And so instead of being a paved trail, it could be a grass
Oh,
path,
sure.
and there could be a picnic table down
And the
there.
maple trees that are there are good size, they'd be nice shade trees,
Yeah,
if you
Big,
could.
big oaks.
yeah.
What are you gonna do with the road, Melrose Street?
So the street, the plan right now would be to terminate it here. It's a good question. We're thinking of, we're still thinking about exactly how to connect to the bridge that's gonna remain and come through. So perhaps the road may find its way over here through one of these locations or be a loop. It's still kind of a work in progress.
Are you considering the paving to be permeable, like that parking lot over by the covered bridge?
We hadn't thought about the surface of the road, but that's an option. Consider permeable paving on the road. Yeah.
If the road's gonna go, is that gonna be the bridge to nowhere?
No, it's gonna connect to a road.
Okay.
So
Well, you
there,
just said the road's going away up front, so I'm.
yeah,
I was
well,
confused.
we're gonna connect through either where that furthest building goes down or come around. We just haven't sort of laid that out yet.
You're gonna have to build another bridge, aren't you?
We're not building another bridge now. We're gonna use the same bridge, just the fill is, it's gonna slope up to the bridge instead of be straight across.
So you can do that.
Is that hatch area, where, are you going to be excavating down, is that A 3 to 4 foot level?
That's the slope,
Yeah.
and then all this will be lower.
So how do you connect with, well, I mean, you can still connect with the bridge. I mean, you still have a road coming in
Yeah.
through there?
Yeah, we talked about taking it out, but we've talked with the town, fire department and others, and they're like, we really should keep that road, so there's 2 points in and out of
Well,
it.
the road is on the other side of the floodplain, on the other side of the bridge. You got all that floodplain there. How's the
That's
road, how's the road gonna, I can't see how the road's gonna connect to the
Maybe
bridge.
go to the
That should
next
cover down the
slide.
bridge or something.
Yeah, the next slide. Because this is, so what's gonna happen is, right now, the bridge comes here, and then it comes flat across. This is actually the existing ground with the dotted line, and what we're gonna do is just go straight down, and that's gonna be the floodplain. So you'll have to drive
Oh,
up
I
a little
see.
bit of a hill to get onto the bridge now, as opposed to come off at a flat level. And that works moving up and down the site, so the whole thing's lower and come down.
In other words, the people are only gonna have one way to get out, that's all this gets done.
No, they'll still have the
No, they'll
other,
have to.
Melrose
Yeah.
Street, where
Yeah.
it joins Route 9 at the bridge.
And this
Yeah,
location.
and this location as well. So this bridge, the one at the window stays, and then you'll be able to access Route 9 at the other end of Melrose Street as well.
Yeah, but when it gets all done, not when they're working.
Oh, you're saying during construction?
Oh, during construction?
We'll work on the sequencing. Ideally, we're trying to maintain both points.
Yep.
So we might have to build the road and then work around that.
As far as the timing, once the project actually starts, how long do you anticipate lasting? The
Um,
way that it is set up now, not including those other buildings.
Sure, that's a great question. I would say you're looking at a couple of months of work, maybe less. It really depends on, it will be a publicly bid project, and then the contractor, we might put some requirements on how much machinery they put and allocate and how much. It's a lot of excavation, a bit of demolition work, so I think it could be a couple months of work, maybe 6 weeks to 8 weeks.
Well, that seems quick.
So before the projects that we've been talking about, the land and the river, we are first going to have those buildings removed, correct?
Correct.
They were created back in 1960s.
Mhm.
Is there any concern, of asbestos, lead paint, air quality for people around here?
I can answer that. So for all projects that go through FEMA funding, including demolition of structures, a demolition contractor has to certify the property as acceptable to come down, including lead and asbestos survey work. If it's done, then a qualified contractor, if there is any mediation that needs to be done, a qualified contractor will have to come in and clean it prior to demolition. So there won't be any neighboring issues or harm from those substances.
So no air quality fluffing around or anything for all of us residents and those on Melrose Street?
No, there won't be.
Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we, oh, Rod, did you want to add something?
No, but
No, I just want to say, with respect to the buildings, I'm not a demolition expert, but having seen them pretty much torn apart after the storm, I think once we remove appliances and things like that, sinks and things from them, they're going to come down very quickly. There's not a whole lot there.
I'm planning to save all the windows and doors.
We're gonna save as much as we can. We're gonna salvage it for our purposes. We are not gonna, at least at this point, we have no intention of contracting with some kind of salvage company or offering it to individuals. That would be just a huge undertaking. So we will salvage what we need and what we think would, the windows here are relatively new, and we have the same windows at other places. So there's a lot, and the appliance, there's a lot of things that the Housing Authority can salvage and use again, and that's what we'll do.
This building is gonna stay.
For the foreseeable future, yes, because
I
people
worked
live
on this
here.
building as a mason tender. I mixed cement in it by hand, in a metal tub by hand for 3 brick masons, one summer, putting the bricks and pulling it up on pulley with a pail of cement. That was some,
Well, you did a good job because this is the only building, this floor did not flood.
you wouldn't even let me use the cement.
All right, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Brian now to go over the floodplain maps and the pictures of the floodplain, and then we can do more questions about any of this after.
So this is a good slide to start with because it kind of tells a little bit of a story on how we create the floodplain maps. So each of these are a cross-section, and that represents the existing ground, and then you can see the darker line here represents the proposed grades that we've been looking at throughout this study. And we use a computer simulation model to tell us or estimate where the water would be. That's these other lines, these flat lines that tell us where the flood levels will be during a certain storm or flood. So the top line here, that's the existing 100-year. And then you can see a little bit lower down, you have a darker line, that's the proposed 100-year. So this is our flood reduction during the 100-year flood. And then we've also got, let's see if I can find a better example.
And how many feet is that, sir?
I think in this particular, well, throughout this reach, we're seeing like from about 1 foot to 2 feet of flood reduction up close to the river. So this is where the normal channel is. And then if you can see just, there's a dash line right underneath that solid line. That's the existing 10-year flood, which is a little bit smaller flood. And then the dark line here is the proposed 10-year flood. So you can see under our proposed conditions, this floodplain is just starting to get water during a 10-year flood. So that's kind of an overview of the modeling, the software that we use to generate flood. So you can see under our proposed conditions, this floodplain is just starting to get water during a 10-year flood. So that's kind of an overview of the modeling, the software that we use to generate these maps. And let's see if I can get this next slide. Okay, so this is a bird's eye view. What you're seeing here, I think the building we're in is that one here. These blue lines are FEMA's representation of where the 100-year floodplain boundary is. These purple dashed lines are where cross-sections are located. And at each one of these cross-sections, you have a floodplain elevation. And then you take that elevation and you kind of go out in either direction until you hit the ground. And that's how you determine the limits of flooding. So the green and the orange areas here are our proposed or our existing and proposed floodplain limits for a 10-year flood event. So you have, if you see, this is where that Route 9 bridge is, and how this kind of spreads out. That's the backwatering that Roy was mentioning. And then it kind of narrows up through here, and then you can see that the existing kind of spreads out in this area. And that's just basically low-lying land on either side that would get inundated in its current condition. Once we implement the floodplain restoration, that would occur along here, where we're lowering the grades. It helps to lower the flood elevations because you have more storage. So now you can see the green. You don't really have any changes down here because the flood restoration is occurring up here. But you can see as you go upstream, you start to pull in that floodplain and kind of contain it more in the channel, rather than it getting up on the overbanks and spreading out. So this is the 10-year flood scenario. And I also have a slide here. So now this is a little bit bigger flood. This is a 50-year flood event. And now you can see the orange, which represents the existing conditions. A lot of the buildings here in Melrose Terrace are being flooded. And then once you improve the flood storage along here, the green becomes your new extent of flooding. So really, you see a big impact here and some impact here, where that starts to pull in. Yes?
So is the green water?
The green is the water, yeah, that's like the water spreading out, and the orange is existing, and then the green kind of represents what happens under, future conditions if we implement the floodplain restoration.
Will the blue or red line, once this project is done, will it move east?
This blue line,
Yes, will it move east or northeast?
yeah, so that's the next slide, and that's part of this
Okay,
whole
'cause we
project
live in the trailer park.
here.
Yeah, right there.
Okay.
That first trailer's mine.
Okay, so, yeah, that will, one of the goals of this project is to change the FEMA mapping, to update it based on more recent information, more, higher resolution data that we have today. The original FEMA studies were done in the 70s and 80s, and they haven't really been updated since. So we have much better data now, and we've also, are proposing this project that will help reduce the flooding. Yes.
Have any changes been made in what constitutes a 50-year flood or a 10-year flood? I mean, we've had 50-year floods 2 in a row and, inside of 2 years, and I know it doesn't mean it happens every 50 years, but
Yes.
is that changing, especially considering the changes in?
That's a good point. So in this particular study, we're not proposing to change the amount of water flowing downstream, but that is something that we do look at often. This mapping exercise is just comparing what was used previously to what's now, or what is proposed here along this channel. Yes.
Can you show me where the maintenance garage is on that map?
Where's my house?
Is that?
It's
No,
next
it's
Oh,
to
this
the
one.
garage.
It's this one.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought, thank you.
Yeah.
So just for your question, right, under the 50-year flood, that's a flood that has a 2% chance of happening every year. So out of 100%, that's very low. But when this project gets done, you would not flood during a flood like this. That's what that map says. The orange is what's there now, and the green is what would be there in the future after this project. So the floodplain comes way into the river.
Yes.
Where do you anticipate that blue line going in terms of the 100-year flood?
So that's the next slide. If there's one more, did you have a question?
Yeah, it seems like earlier you mentioned that the Route 9 bridge was a 30-year flood bridge.
Yeah, I believe it was 25 to...
Yeah.
So isn't that really where you're having a lot of your backup is right there? We're considering that huge mass of green, is that caused by the Melrose Bridge or the Route 9 bridge?
It's definitely part of it, because the water has to be kind of narrowed down to get through there.
Right. And you do realize during Irene that it broke over Route 9 before it reached the bridge.
That's right.
Yeah.
So is there anything addressing any of that?
Not
Is that not a part of this?
Not as part of this project.
Okay.
It's not a part of this because we cannot impact land that we do not own, and we cannot compel the state of Vermont to repair a bridge. And that's Route 9, and that's their bridge. So we had to work around
But
those.
there is suggestions for the future of replacing that bridge or something mentioned?
We can make those suggestions, and I think that we made them at the scoping study when the state of Vermont folks were here. So we've certainly brought this to their attention, and they know about it, and they know about its impact on the flooding in this area.
VTrans and the town are both aware of the limitations that that bridge presents, and although it was overtopped during Irene, structurally the bridge is sound, and so VTrans has many other demands on its capital, and it's not at the top of their list for replacement. But there's
Seems
certainly,
like it would affect this project a lot if that bridge was dealt with first.
I think that I'll let Roy and Brian speak to that, but what I'd say is Chris's point that what we're doing here is really just making modifications to the land that's under control of Brattleboro Housing Partnership is the key to this project. Everyone recognizes that there's a benefit to having that bridge repositioned or modified or replaced. But in terms of the benefit deriving from this project, the cost of the replacement of the bridge doesn't necessarily justify doing that right now, is what I'd say. Recognizing that ultimately in an ideal situation, yes, the bridge would get switched out. It's not a small item to replace.
I would assume that, but it also affects so much of what you're talking about.
Right.
You know, I mean, how that ripples all the way down, as you know, through water control. And I understand what you're saying, you're concentrated on this particular area, but obviously it affects each other.
Okay, so now we'll look at, so this is the 100-year flood. So the green would become our new floodplain. That's part of this project where we're going to submit an application to FEMA, and through this section from about here to just downstream of the bridge, the green would become the new flood and inundation area for the 100-year flood. But part of that is also the flood depths decrease. So in this area, under the existing condition, there's like 3 feet of water, 3 to 4 feet of water. And under proposed conditions, even though the extents go, you know, beyond here, the flood depths is reduced to, I believe, 1 foot to a half a foot all throughout here. So that drastically changes the way the damages are calculated through here, and becomes a benefit to those reductions in damage. So even though, I mean, these areas would, you know, the blue line is where FEMA currently has their floodplain boundary, and the orangish colored line is where we're saying the existing conditions is located, and the green would be the proposed conditions once the floodplain is, the restoration project is implemented.
Is there any chance in the request for map revision that FEMA would actually change that line to match your green line?
Well, it's considered a letter of map revision that they distribute and they release, and it becomes part of their floodplain mapping. So you can go and you can find that letter, and they'll show you where the line is. I don't believe that they would actually officially draw this line on their map until they redraw their maps or update their mapping.
So I guess what I'm saying is, what's the likelihood of their accepting this as the new, as a revision to the maps that now exist by letter?
So, right, it takes a process.
Right.
They review all of our work, and there's some back and forth with FEMA until they are satisfied with our work, and then that's when, you know, they'll make the determination to.
Right. Okay. So I'm John Borker-Campbell, I'm the Regional Floodplain Manager. The answer to, I think, to your question is very likely that they will accept it.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, good.
Right. They use their best available data. This is far better data than what they had when they created that map back in the late 70s, probably.
Right. Yeah.
So.
And that's one thing I wanted to bring up that John just mentioned, is that a lot of the edge differences you see here aren't a function of this project. Some of them are a function of the fact that there's aerial data collected in contour mapping that people who made these original maps never had. So now we know like what the topography is and how that's changing, and that changes a little bit of this map alone.
Right.
Then there's the difference between the orange, I'm a little colorblind, the orange or red and the green. Those are areas where the project is actually improving conditions. So what Brian mentioned, you don't see that all the flood depths here are dropping because this is a floodplain restoration project, but then there's contraction of the floodplain. Like, I mean, from that blue line all the way in to the green line, or the shrinking of that floodplain width, like right in there.
One location here.
Yeah, is a function of the project.
Well, actually, if I may, I was with you up until that last statement because, for example, these properties here got the letter of map amendments, so it was based on more accurate data just in the last few months. So that's the data that you were referring to that has shrunken up the blue.
Right. That's right.
Where I missed you, where I was with you was where you were saying that the blue isn't really accurate.
That's right.
The red is more based on better data.
That's right.
And then when it goes to the green, that's a result
Of the
of the
project.
project.
That's
Yes.
right.
Okay.
So like you see the difference between the red and the green sliver, that's a function of the project.
Maybe it was the colorway thing.
Okay. I
But
might
that
have
old
misspoke.
building, once the other Melrose buildings are taken down, the brown spot in the middle where it says Melrose, right
Here,
there, will that all be filled in with green in
Um,
time?
yeah, actually, that's probably just it's kind of like
Not
a
just
low
that one
spot.
spot, but the whole triangle,
yeah, this whole triangle.
yeah.
So, that's a good question. I mean, as this, right now, the floodplain restoration is
Right,
gonna occur
we're doing that
here.
now, but when
If
the
this
other
is
buildings come
removed-
down, you plan to lower the grade level there too? To make
Correct.
the whole floodplain?
So this may become floodplain, but there'll be no buildings or no infrastructure there.
Right, but that's down the road.
Yeah.
Correct, yeah. And it may actually reduce this if you think you're spreading out the water throughout that location. You may see more benefit through here as well.
Yeah.
So just to chime in again, so yes, it may affect the map flood hazard area when that second step is done, but I suspect that you won't go through this letter of map revision process again. This is a function of the grant, of the FEMA grant that you're getting. So when the housing authority does the removal, if they don't use the same funding source, there may not be the need to do this map revision update again. So it might be, we might know it's outside the flood hazard area, but it might not technically appear to be outside the flood hazard area.
Have you done any studies on if that area was a part of the floodplain, how much more benefit you would get from it?
We have looked at all these alternatives that you're talking about, the bridge, the floodplain there and there, and it does reduce the flood levels a little further. We don't have a floodplain map to show you of what that looks like and how that green area would change. I probably would have to look back at our report to recall the exact flood depth reduction and the width reduction, just because we haven't.
Because it seems a pretty sizable area right in the center.
Yeah.
It also, because it's on the southern side of the brook, there are, Melrose Terrace is owned by Brattleboro Housing Partnership, so it's easier as one applicant, whereas those bottom parcels are individual property owners, which makes doing work on their land much more difficult because you have to have buy-in and support from them. So in addition to the bridge, doing work there also requires a great deal of communication, coordination, and voluntary participation from those property owners.
Right, but as far as the land that you are in charge of now, that also is involved a large portion of that center without getting into public property.
That's right.
So those buildings are coming down first along with these out here that are down in that brown area below where it says Melrose and that yellow spot. All of those buildings are coming out now.
I believe these.
All of those up, I know,
Yeah.
up
Yes.
toward the other road. Up
Up here,
here. Those buildings are all
I
coming
believe
out.
those two are as well.
On the end, yeah, you can go back a couple.
Yeah, because
One
some of
road
them I
here.
heard
The
got
first
4
two are coming
The
out.
two at the eastern end come out.
Because some of those I heard got 4 feet of water now.
Yeah.
And my mother was up here next to the brook, the next building up, and she only got 6 inches or so.
Yeah, that's because that's where the water jumped out and it flowed right back behind those buildings. So it's a little unique that, and it could be very different the next flood, but for Irene, they saw deep water and erosion damage along these back buildings.
And
the
those
front
buildings-
building was a little protected because the river was flowing behind them.
Those buildings are below grade than these buildings along the brook too.
Yep.
So that's why I would think you'd want to take them out as soon as those.
Water always flooded up above over that wall. They built a seawall, had it on like a foot of cement. At one time, they're still flooding up there.
Yeah.
But it used to flood like every April. just a little bit, you know, from the snow on the mountains and.
That's here, right, where that little wall is?
We're making
Yeah.
that turn.
We wouldn't want another foot on that cement, living in Glen Drill Park.
That's right, that would push the
John
water
Russell
back.
was not happy when that was put in, as far as I heard, because it held the water back into Glen instead of letting it flow.
Right.
Yeah, and then, yeah, it went real back, yeah.
You like look at the 15%.
Well, the wall was actually added about 5 years after Melrose was opened. The fire department and I went through an exhaustive history of the number of times it flooded and the number of repairs and improvements that the housing authority made within the first 15 years of opening Melrose because it flooded
Right.
like 3 days after they opened it. So,
Yeah.
And the depth of the culvert gonna determine the amount of the relief, as far as footage of water that's gonna be relieved during a flood?
Are you talking the overflow culvert that we would put
Right.
in? Yeah, I mean, we've set that.
Have you given any thoughts to going deeper than the 4 feet, like maybe 15 feet?
We've given thoughts about what elevation to put that at to help evacuate the water, and not,
Well, I was referring to, instead of making it a culvert, what about just like a large natural pond that only fills up when flooding?
yeah, so if we go much deeper, the thing will fill up with water, and then we lose the storage capacity, right? Because if you're digging right by the river, and you dig deeper, it's gonna fill with water. And so that elevation, that storage that's filled with water is essentially already used up, so then the flood comes on top
So
of
in other
that.
words, if you go too far down, there's water down there?
Too far down, you'll hit water. So this thing is set kind of right in the shoulder where when the river starts to come up and starts to flood, it will hit that culvert first, and then it will push the water.
So technically, you can't go lower than what the stream is already.
Yeah, if you're so close there, the water will just fill it up.
Was there.
Yeah. We thought about some storage elements like you're suggesting, but it's probably not something
Yeah,
that
that
would
was,
work.
well, something like what I was suggesting would alleviate even for further down
Yeah.
to Route 9.
When they were talking before about a lot of the water backing up under the Route 9 bridge,
Yeah.
did they ever do any type of computer simulation or anything to see what would happen if the bridge was actually the width supposed to be, as far as it affected this?
Yeah, I mean, we did that.
I mean, I'm probably really naive, but it seems like $20 million, to replace $20 million worth of housing is probably a little bit more than replacing the bridge. But I know this, between the state and federal government and everybody else, it's a real power show, but it's just I'm curious.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, you're not naive. In fact, you're right. The bridge is a key part of the flooding. The flood mitigation, the different elements sort of work together. So you're going to get a benefit from this project.
No, I'm not,
And if you
I
do
mean,
that,
just
you get
it
more
seems like
benefit.
there would be, I mean, there's a farmer's market, for instance, or down
right.
on William Street, there's a huge pond or something that they filled in. I mean, everybody loves to have a new place to live, but you haven't really gained anything. You just replaced 80 units of housing with 80 units of housing. We didn't end up with 160 units of housing for all that money, we just ended up with 80. So, I mean, I know the money's probably the least of the things that they think about when they.
No, it's
Sometimes
probably one of the more
government
important.
gets a little carried away, but.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other important things is the FEMA process hinges on that very rare 1% chance flood. But like, when I see this map, it shows me that there actually are a lot of other important benefits. I mean, this shows that the 10% chance flood, which is, as someone said earlier, that's something we're actually seeing a lot more frequently.
Yeah, no, I wasn't questioning the benefits, it just seemed
Yeah.
like, you're picking the most populated area to do away with as opposed to some other.
Well, I think the opportunities here, and the modeling shows that there are a lot of benefits. And in fact, as part of this process, we have to balance the cost of the project and the benefit. And so this has as a positive cost benefit. It's actually like 2.5 times. And one of the reasons is because when you restore this floodplain, like, it protects all this housing, you know, that's across the brook and what's remaining right here. It shrinks that floodplain for this very frequent flood. So that means, you know, every few years when we see that 10-year flood happen, it seems to be happening more frequently, we're gonna minimize our damages more and more. And that means the cost is worth it. Now, adding on the bridge certainly will improve that. It's gonna protect the downstream end of the project. I mean, you can even see it backing up in just this smaller, this like moderate sized flood.
If they never had a 10-year flood that damaged the buildings, all they ever had was that Irene there, that's the only one that ever
No, that's not
tore
true.
their buildings apart.
No, we've had other floods that have damaged the building.
They had, the road up there, the water came down and went into Mary Ann's.
We've
Once.
had other floods that have damaged buildings.
Well, I've been down here since about 1980 something, and the only time I ever seen any flood, I've been here, every year my mother lived down here, was a little bit of mud came down from over the upper wall, and it drained off into that, what do you call it there, where the water drains off in. I've never seen, I never heard of anything else here, getting flooded down here. Except Mary Ann's.
To me, the main thing is, FEMA says no homes in that area, and they're giving the town and the state time to find housing for people, because they said you've got to get rid of them, and it's gonna cost money, and if they had said the same thing for us in Lime Trailer Park, because we're side of the brook,
Yeah.
then as the trailer park and the town was able to find us homes, we would have to leave too, because this is coming from FEMA and the federal government. And that's something the town or anybody can't change. So you've gotta do it and figure the cost. When you're talking replacing a bridge versus putting in a culvert and lowering the land and remove the buildings, because FEMA has ordered this. And
Well, the other thing is that to Arthur's point, this is federal public housing, and there was a presidential order that covered Melrose when we had the flood. That was shortly made an actual code in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it says, "Thou shalt not spend federal money on any property that is in the floodway."
Right.
So that meant
You have.
we couldn't spend any money on these buildings anymore,
No.
and that, we actually figured that it was gonna take us less time to build a new place to get people out of here than it would to try to get the Route 9 bridge rebuilt. So that was a decision that we made based on really trying to get the population here to a safer place as fast as possible.
And I'm just going to jump in so that it is on public record. FEMA's not kicking anybody out.
Right.
This is a voluntary program. The town, via Brattleboro Housing Partnerships, is applicant. FEMA cannot kick anybody out of their homes through this program, so it was something that the town and Brattleboro Housing Partnerships decided this place is not safe for people to live, and there is a means by which through this grant program that they can get funding to get the residents here out of harm's way. And FEMA then looks at that, considering again, like Roy said, the cost and benefits, said yes, it is unsafe to have housing in this area. Yes, the overall cost of the project is much less than the overall benefit, therefore we're going to give you money to do it, but you cannot get money, town, Brattleboro Housing Partnership, unless you show us that you have found alternate housing, which they had to do as part of this back and forth process over the time. So just camera. FEMA cannot kick anybody out, so they have not kicked anybody out. This is not a mandate by FEMA, and I just want to make sure that that's known by everybody in the room.
Does that mean that we can stay here until forever if they don't ever get the other places built, or is
No.
there a deadline?
No.
Absolute deadline?
We are in the process of developing phase 2, and when we do, everybody will move.
Yes, but
We will close this down.
there will be a phase 2 this summer.
Yes. Very, very shortly.
Do they have a time frame on that?
Pardon?
Do they have a time frame on that?
We are circling on a site as we speak. We've been looking for a site for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and we have now identified one, and in the next month and a half, it will become known where that is.
But then would there be logic into addressing this project if those buildings weren't occupied, and considering you seem to be getting closer to that, does it make sense to move forward with this first?
Yes.
It does?
Yes, yes, because this is all ready to go, and this has taken years to get here. So we absolutely want to go forward on this.
And you've weighed out the additional costs that if you went with the second
Waiting would be
phase.
horrible, because we may not get the opportunity for the FEMA money again. Then we'd have all the buildings, and we'd have everything here, and we'd have absolutely no money to take anything down. So it's much better to do this project that we've spent a lot of time and have pretty much FEMA saying, yeah, we'll help you take it down, and it's expensive. And then deal with phase 2 when we get there. I mean, it took us almost 5 years to do Red Clover. Now that's a bigger building, but it is a long process to develop affordable housing in Vermont. So, you know, while we may be close to zeroing in on a site, that means we're probably 2 to 3 years away from moving people into that new building.
So we'll be able to stay here until phase 2 is complete.
Is opened,
The
yes.
people- Oh, that's good.
Yep.
Thank you. That's what I came for.
Yep.
So you're saying that that pushes, the last date I've heard for us was phase 2, we had to be out by July of 2019.
Well, that's not gonna happen.
That,
no.
okay, so
No, we're
don't
gonna-
even think of that, because I'm thinking you guys got a lot of big work to do to come up with the rest of our homes.
Well, right, and,
Yeah, so
and
phase
that
2.
was the those were the numbers we put into a revised disposition and demolition application to HUD, and we
Okay.
did that about 2 or 3 years ago when we thought it would be easier to find a second site, and it wasn't. So now I actually, that's on my work plan, I have to send an amendment to HUD on those dates and say, we think we just found it, and it's going to take us another probably good 2.5 years once you get the permitting, the funding, and then construction.
I figured that had to change because I'd never heard anything past that July 2019, so I figured something had to be shifting, but I just hadn't heard anything.
Right,
Anyway.
right.
Okay, thanks for
Right.
that.
Well, we really couldn't, you know, it's been so much up in the air that, and this has only really come together in the last couple of months. So now we really can go back to HUD, to another part of HUD, and say, we think, these are the dates now. We're going to amend this, it's pushed further out.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, just to kind of summarize, so the map that you see here, the background of this map is FEMA's actual floodplain boundary map. They call it the flood insurance rate map. And we've superimposed, as part of this FEMA application, we need to kind of superimpose our proposed floodplain. And this would be all part of the FEMA package that gets sent to them for review and approval by FEMA.
That's basically it, right?
This is it, yeah. This will be the result of that Clomar application.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm gonna go watch the Red Sox here.
Should have given you that first.
So, can I ask Chris, besides that 2019 date, I felt like I also had in there a but if for some reason we have another jumping of the wall and flooding prior to all this really happening, that we had to be evacuated to somewhere, we'd have to have some places, and nobody would fix this back up even if phase 2 wasn't ready, that we wouldn't be back here, period.
Yes,
Is
and
that
that's always
still-
been true.
Is that
Yes,
still
that has always been
holds
true.
true? So we just pray no more.
Right, that has always been true.
Correct. So that can
Since
still,
the day after, since
Correct.
April of 2012, when we reopened Melrose, it has always been true that if we had another devastating flood
Yes.
and we had significant damage to this property, we were done.
even a smaller flood though?
Well, it's all a matter of what's,
We'll find out.
size and, it would be hard to, I can't predict, but I can tell you that the arrangement, the agreement, whatever you want to call it, the understanding between Boston HUD, us, and the town is that if this property gets damaged badly again, and all to be decided, and there's lots of different ways that it's calculated, and there's all kinds of spreadsheets and things that go into that. But if this property and buildings that remain get damaged again, we will not repair it. And what will happen is, I periodically just call Boston and say, do you still have those? We would get tenant protection vouchers for the remaining tenants, and then our whole focus would be on trying to find adequate housing for the remaining residents in nonprofit and private landlord apartments in the community.
Thank you, I'm gonna move next door with the Sparks.
Okay, good.
And I'm gonna be their maid. Sounds good.
So this is just a list of the next steps. One of the things that we're actively working on is preparing that conditional letter of map revision application that will be submitted to FEMA for approval and or review and approval. And part of that is that there'll be more notice for all of you folks that this process is going on, either in the mail or also notification through the paper, an ad in the paper. And part of that will be to seek that funding from FEMA to do the work. We have more work to do on the plans to bring them up to more detail so that they can be bid for construction, and implementation in 2019. I don't know if that's
2018, 19.
Yeah. So
18.
Gotta be 18.
18.
Has to be.
Yeah.
So that's the list of the next steps to move the project forward.
I think I just want to reiterate that formal announcement. So one of the goals of this meeting was to give you background, because these things come, they're full of FEMA jargon. There's a format, and you're going to be like, what does that mean if you see this? And what it means is, like, if you go back, it just means that this map's changing because of this restoration project, this first phase that we've talked about today. So now you're informed. Happy to answer more questions or look at the plans.
Quick question. The sewer line for the private homes that are along the back side, is any of that changing? Is there?
So part of the design is there are utilities all throughout this that are going to be pulled back and terminated. So there will be utility work. There are some river crossings of the utilities that service the houses in the back. So we're looking at, that's kind of a work in progress right now, is making sure everything's going to function after.
That would be nice.
No, it is.
I'd like to be able to flush.
Yeah. You'll be able to drink water, flush, power, like it's all going to be good. So yeah.
And so just before letting other people go, I want to make it clear to everyone here that this is a meeting that is part of the process. It's part of the FEMA mandated process, and it's also part of the way Chris and I work, both the town and Brattleboro Housing Partnerships. And the follow-up to this is that it's going to be an agenda item on the select board meeting next Tuesday night. That's April the 3rd. And it's basically the same thing all over again. So if you've still got questions or want to make some kind of comment or something, and you can make it to the select board meeting, that's 6:15. We probably won't be on until more like 6:30 or 7 o'clock. But you're more than welcome to come. And if you can't make it, but you still have a question, feel free to email me or email Chris, and we'll see what we can do for you. But just wanted to let you know that we've had an ad in the paper to alert people to this meeting. We've sent out letters to neighbors so that you would know that this meeting was on, and the follow-up to that is the last part of this process of public outreach will be the select board meeting next week. After that, we expect to take all your comments into consideration and then put the package together, and the town will sign, as well as Chris representing Brattleboro Housing Partnerships, and we'll send it off to FEMA and hopefully it'll work. So.
Will there be another meeting like this for the final draft or the final design, or no?
I don't believe so. I think that what we're addressing here, there's a lot of really good questions here about what the effect of the project is going to be, which is really what these maps represent. That project is pretty much designed at this point in terms of the impact on these, if you like, these lines on the map. So that's understood at a technical level, and it meets the requirements for the application process. So in that sense, I don't think that there's too much need for further public comment on this part of the project. What we're doing here is, because some of the lines on the map that we've been talking about today have kind of a legal significance in terms of designating whether a property is in the 100-year or floodplain or the floodway, there are legal consequences for us actually proposing a change. More typically, people are proposing something like this to actually suggest to FEMA that they're going to do development in a floodplain and that there won't be a bad impact as a consequence of that development. What we're doing is almost the reverse. We're saying that we're actually pulling out of the floodplain, and that's good news for the floodplain, which will shrink these lines, which should make things better. So we're stuck with a process that's assuming that we're doing something, whereas what we're actually doing is withdrawing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rod,
Yeah.
it looks on this map that all of Glen Trailer Park is flooded, because I can see where Western Avenue is above Glen Street. I don't see any trailers that are not in the green, what the 444 number is.
Right there?
Yeah, that's Glen Trailer Park. I don't see any trailers that they're all in the floodplain.
Well, this tannish orange line,
Yeah, that's up here.
you're already in it. So
Yeah,
The blue line kind of shows you where the existing floodplain is, so, you know, all of this area in here is considered inside the floodplain.
so will you be moving a lot of them trailers down the road?
well, that's a separate from a policy standpoint and kind of a project standpoint, that's a separate process. What I'd say here is that the green blob is slightly smaller than the orange blob, but the orange blob is also underneath the green blob. So it really amounts to no change in the status of homes at Glen Park. You're in the floodplain now, you'll be in the floodplain after
Okay,
this.
because I see the green covering all of it.
Yeah, it's more, that's
So
more
I wondered if
kind of a coloring in
I
effect.
understand it's not part of the FEMA project as far as Melrose. That's
You're-
something
but you-
completely different.
From a project standpoint, you raise a really important question, and there's a process underway for Tri-Park to work with the owners of Glen Street, Mobile Home Park, to work with the town and state officials again to actually look at what the best future outcome is for mobile homes that are located in the floodplain and the floodway. But that's separate from today's discussion.
Okay, so we live in the little house way in the back, like you all know that.
Yep.
So from what I understood, the road is gonna end before we get to our house. So if there is no way for us to come out and go over the Glen George F. Miller Bridge, okay? So if we're gonna have to come up and go out over the other bridge, that turn is very dangerous. So is that where I would mention my concern about that and the increased activity of turning onto Western Avenue? Do I mention that to the select board, since you say you have no jurisdiction over the bridge? Who has jurisdiction over making sure that all of the people that are now having to get funneled out that way are going to be safer?
Well, so let's go back. One of the things that they mentioned is there still will be two ways to enter and exit from your house.
I heard them say that, but then they said there would be no road.
No, there is going to be a road. We're gonna have to rebuild the road from the George Miller Bridge to connect to Melrose Street for you and the other people that live back.
So whether the road takes exactly the same shape as it does now, or it changes through this section through here, that's the unanswered part. The ability of you to get from your house here to George Miller Drive and across the bridge this way, that's not in doubt. You'll be able to do it. It's just exactly where that road goes as it goes through this parcel here, which is all floodplain. So it's a level of detail of the project that hasn't been resolved yet.
Okay, thank you for explaining it.
Yeah.
So I might have misspoke before
No,
when I said it stops, but we're just not exactly sure. It might come in and tee right across the middle.
Well,
So-
and now you're not limited to where the houses are, to where to put the road, so you
That's
can put
right.
the road wherever you want. Okay,
Exactly.
that's
So
cool.
right now, the road makes a kind of a loop, and
Yes.
it may not have exactly that form, but you still will be able to access this bridge, because that's one of the
Got it.
concerns that
Yes.
the town and the fire department had at the beginning, that we should
Okay.
preserve this way as an access point. And it would be crazy to leave the bridge and then do not. I mean, it's not impossible that we would do it, but actually it's crazy. So, yeah.
so the one thing for folks that are Melrose residents, we will be sending out at least a notice prior to any construction start. And I would assume, knowing you all and knowing us, that we would probably have a meeting and go over what the conditions were, when work was going to start, sort of what was the staging. You know, the buildings are going to come down, and guess what? It's going to take 3 weeks, and they'll all be gone. I don't know. I'm making it up. But I'm sure that we will have conversations with you and give you some advance notice when before this work starts. So we'll be in touch about it.
Could you do that for Glen Trail Park, not just each resident, but at least send Troy Park a notice that you're going to be doing demolishing buildings?
Sure.
Because we live just across the road.
Yeah, we'll do the same. We'll do the same.
It's just like a notification.
Yeah, sure.
We get it personally, or Troy Park
I don't mean to.
lets us know, that would be fine.
Yeah, we'll do it the same way that we did for this meeting, so you'll be both the
Just so
office
we know.
and you guys. Yeah.
We don't wake up in the morning and you're jackhammering out there.
Well,
at
it's
7 o'clock.
a hard way to wake up. Yes.
Could you do that for those of us that live behind
Yeah.
too?
Yes.
Yeah, so what we'll do is, Rod has the list of everybody that got this notice. So what's, I'm just saying for the Melrose people, we'll probably have a couple of meetings with them so that they really are very clear about what's going to be happening because they live here. And there'll be a lot of construction equipment. But once we have a project laid out and we know some kind of blocks of sequencing, then I think we can put that together in a note that we can send everybody and say, it's going to start, we think we're going to start on this day, we think the work will take this long to do this much. All understanding that it's construction work and anything can change.
Right,
But
and then
yes.
the last point on this is the Brattleboro Housing Partnerships will need to obtain a permit from the Development Review Board for the floodplain restoration project because of what it's a form of development basically, even though most of what that actually involves is removing some structures. So that'll be in the paper the same way it normally is. You'll be able to watch that meeting on TV the way you normally can now. And I'm sure because Chris is here now and he'll be watching, there'll be an article about it in the Brattleboro Reformer as well. It'll be pretty hard to miss the build up to this because it's a big deal for all of us. Like, we'll be really excited about it.
Any other questions for the engineers or Rod or myself? Please feel free to contact any of us if you have further
for sure.
questions. And you can take a look at those plans. So thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.